Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here, and get ready for Gnosis. Well, in the kind of shocking book, Bruce Lee Lives by Max Caulfield, he goes into details about Bruce Lee and his possible survival. And, of course, if there was a death, what was linked to that? So, as the book goes through there, of course, it gives you some very interesting details and about his particular death, which I'm not sure too many people have investigated properly here. It's a very strange death again. So, there does seem to be a problem with some sort of major medical condition that he somehow obtained when he was in Hong Kong. Before that, there doesn't seem to be any record of him having these kind of problems that he was taking medication for and ultimately killed him. Very, very interesting when you start looking. And what this book does as well is documents the horrible situation that this planet has been plagued with for the beginning of time. And that is corruption, and particularly police corruption, which has been the case with police since there's been police. This even goes back to Wyatt Earp days, who were considered Republicans working for the railroads. Everybody thinks they were Western heroes. Another nonsense there. They enforce what police do, as the whores that they are. They enforce the policies of the politicians instead of enforcing the laws, as well as being highly corrupt and, of course, filling their pockets in the process by working with organized crime. What this book details is the actual Hong Kong police at that particular time when Bruce Lee was alive, and I'm sure it's quite worse now. All police are corrupt, they're all on the take, they all work with organized crime. Anybody doesn't know that, grow up. You keep living in an illusion, and this is what brings you. This is nothing new in the 1920s, not a single cop civilian, of course, and what should a civilian do anyway? Judge, etc., would testify against Al Capone. They had to get him on taxes. Why? Corruption, police corruption, and the cowards. What about Serpico? Remember that old movie? Yeah, well, people seem to forget that. That's what brought to prominence Al Pacino. That was one of his first big movies, but of course that's overlooked. Or even Super Cops, which was made into a horrible movie, but all you got to do is read that book and read about the horrible corruption in New York City and everywhere. Under the Los Angeles Police Department's building in the 1920s during Prohibition, they had tunnels built to smuggle alcohol. Was that wonderful? So we go on and on and on. So, of course, this is not an issue that anybody should even question. It's just that how much of this relates directly to his death. It's very, very interesting, and people should look at this instead of looking at whom this person was and what he supposedly achieved. Regardless of whether you like or dislike Bruce Lee, he never professionally fought, never proved any skills. He talked how great he was and put on demonstrations. That's the facts. So let's stay to the facts here, but whether you're a supporter or not, police corruption and the murder of people need to be clarified. Now, this also goes into the fact that there was apparently, and you're talking about here a time of many, many years ago, 40, 50 years ago, and it's estimated by the author of this book that the average cop was taking in $18,000 a week. That would be equivalent to probably $100,000 today. This is, or at least whomever was corrupt there. And of course, at that particular time, this was run by the British, and of course they hired locals as well. So, and I'm sure the British were pocketing a great deal as well. So, whomever is there, they're all tied in and they all know what's going on. But the bottom line is that of course, the world, because of this and other factors, the world is ran by organized crime. Again, grow up, people. That's how it works. United States, the cops are basically the poodle of organized crime. Plain and simple. They work together to fill their pockets, and they murder and harass people as they choose to fill their pockets. So it's very interesting as we look at all these things of how the procedure goes of what happened with Bruce Lee. Well, it's been, and it apparently seems to be the case. There was no hospitalizations of Bruce Lee in the United States. There was some talk, which is now under some debate, that he had hurt himself extremely badly, his back, by doing a lot of the strength training that he'd like to do to show off. There's been other things that said that this isn't the case, but it does seem to be that that may have been some of the case. We don't know. This is something to be looked into because there was a autopsy show, a television series that went through the deaths of famous people, and there didn't seem to be any damage to the back per that TV show. Well, that's very interesting. Now, how valid that is, who knows? It's like everything else in life. It's just information. It's somebody's opinion, warped or not, from whatever material he looked at, and then he gives his opinion. So this is a problem of all of life. And anyone who's a seeker of gnosis, of wisdom, of fact, of truth, understands that the information you're trying to ascertain what truth is from is very, very sketchy at best and extremely prejudiced. So as we go into that, so we know that the Hong Kong police, as all police around the world, are highly, highly corrupt, and we need to look at these things for what they actually are. And that is the level of corruption that was going on there, and how the triads who run the world today, or at least Asia, continue to run all the companies. And people have no idea what level this is. These organized crime people take over and working with the police, take over Walmarts, all the big stores. They all go into these things, I allege, and I've seen it personally happen. So if you think that this is some sort of strange occurrence, well, you better grow up, as if all doctors as well are controlled by these people, and where you think all the illegal drugs from that get on the markets. So it goes on and on of how they control everyone, whether you are sick, well, or anything else. So to think that this is some sort of bizarre statement, and we can go into another martial artist, and a lot of people don't like Steven Seagal. He's kind of a wild dude, weird, makes a lot of claims. Who knows? Life is funny, and certainly he has been directly involved with harassment from organized crime from an old partner of his who was then connected to the American mafia, the Italian mafia, who blackmailed him and wanted money from him for future film deals, of which he paid some apparently, and also was threatened there by organized crime, apparently the mafia, or the Italian mafia out of New York, because one of his partners at one time was apparently connected to them directly or indirectly. And there was talk that he wanted to be part of them, etc. So he was trying to get into the organized crime this way, but of course they didn't let him in, which is typical of so much organized crime. They don't really care about you. They just, there's not some brotherhood here. They just want to get your money. So he eventually got involved with the FBI and so forth, and had some of these people arrested and so forth, which is why he's very careful of where he lives. And while an interview of a few years ago, he showed living in Arizona with a machine gun, telling people that he was ready for anybody. So these are, again, facts that are in the media. So to think that this is unusual and movie stars aren't involved in these kind of things, you are illusionary again. You know, the problem is everybody's got this strange reality they live in, and I look back and didn't believe this kind of corruption in the past, but now that I've seen it firsthand for many, many years, and I look back of talking to other people, from common people on up, the amount of corruption out there is unbelievable. So in every single business, if there's lots of money there, well, who do you think's going to show up at your door? And this includes large corporations as well, Microsoft, Apple, all the big box stores who are in countries like Mexico and other things. They're all paying off criminals to leave them alone. That's the way it goes because you have no law enforcement. Law enforcement are the criminals. So getting back to this issue, it seemed to be a kind of a very interesting case. I think a movie should be made about it. Not only was he went over there and basically everybody yawned at him, they didn't want to pay him anything for his movies, etc. He was an actor and presented a great image and style and put that into his pretty garbagey films that he made, which were, of course, were a lot better than the garbage that normally came out of Hong Kong, which was nothing more than for 2 hours of people fighting. Which is fun for the first 20 minutes, and then it's pretty boring. Of course, the cinematography, the storylines, all of these things were just horrible, etc. So, regardless of that, he gained some amount of fame. And people think that he was so popular back then. He wasn't. His films did do more than most other films because of an interesting and better style by a consummate actor, which Bruce Lee was since the age of 5, and his father was also an actor. So he comes from an acting family. He knew what to do to look cool. So the whole idea is that and he was well known in the film industry. So, what apparently happened here is the fact that he was approached and told that he was going to profits that he was going to make, similar to what happened to Seagal, that he was going to pay all this money to the Dryads, and apparently refused. As the story goes. Of course, as with all these things, it's completely and totally unprovable. Well, of course it is. I always find this amusing with people that think that conspiracies and other things are a joke and there's no proof. Well, if there was proof, then there wouldn't be a conspiracy or this hidden criminality and corruption that goes on. So you can never know the truth because there's no way of finding it out. But we do get the bigger picture. And this was common in the world of entertainment in Hong Kong, that most of the people in that industry were paying organized crime. Now, at this time, Bruce Lee, of course, was known to be a very egotistical person and certainly didn't want to share. After all, he went to Hong Kong to make money and to become famous. Which he could not really obtain that well in the United States, even though for someone who was unknown, for someone who spoke extremely poor English, he did fairly well in the United States. The fact that he didn't get big breaks at that time was just the fact that he needed to hang around a little longer. And maybe if his Hong Kong films made it, that he could have done better in the United States. But we got to remember that, martial arts films are not big box office, period. While Chuck Norris and a few others came after him and did these B films that were made inexpensively and made it to the DVD store shelves, is something, of course, that is the reality. But in terms of lots and lots of money, blockbusters, none of them don't. Even action films today supposedly don't do that well. So there's an awful lot of facts here, but let's get back into that. So this is very common. It's common all around the world. It's even more common in Asia, where everything is run by organized. I don't know if it's any more in Asia now than anywhere else. Europe is horribly corrupt. The Germans are some of the most corrupt people on the planet. Their police are all cowards and paid off. It goes on and on and on of how terrible all that is. We see that in Britain, where you have no freedom whatsoever, and the police came out and shot some guy in the head 9 times in the subway. What is going on here? So it's you really have to grow up, people. So the whole idea is that, getting back to Bruce Lee here, is the fact that then a typical scenario went down. Now, taking a celebrity like this, and everybody lives in a comic book world, and they think, well, they just kill you. They're just going to kill you. They're going to shoot you in the street. They're going to knife you. They're going to strangle you and throw you off a building. I mean, this kind of comic book thinking doesn't even work too well in the movies anymore because of the fact that they're just a little bit too outrageous. That's not how you do things. Certainly you can, and certainly the average guy, I guess, could disappear and be killed, and I'm sure there's plenty of this going on to a certain degree. But you don't do that with anybody who's kind of public or known or who people are watching. You do other things. So the whole idea is that as we get into the reality of how do you handle a problematic person, especially when it goes around the industry, that he didn't want to pay. So what does that mean to everybody else? So we get into the whole story of that you run into problems when someone doesn't want to pay that everybody else thinks they don't have to pay. So it becomes this problem of that you have to enforce it. So what happens is the fact that you do something that is kind of indirect. Now, first of all, he was hanging around with pretty much an actress who's known to kind of be the sex whore of the industry, who was sent to different people as part of the manipulation of people. He was having an affair with this woman and spending a lot of time with her, which is the place that he initially died at or was at when she gave him medication. Isn't that interesting? So, but this is not, of course, strange either. She is controlled and her life is in danger, and sure did many, many favors for organized crime, plain and simple. So, this is again well known, and of course people don't want to talk about it. So all of a sudden, here's a guy who's basically very well, and all of a sudden starts to have problems over there. Apparently, he had problems before the last time that he never came back to consciousness. Apparently, he had a problem again, which before that, where he was brought to the hospital with some sort of problem similar to this. So it looked like there was a building up of some sort of toxins or toxicity medication in his system. And this was apparent by him apparently going to the hospital before this incident. Then all of a sudden, he's not feeling good. She's there to help, and of course, she's at her house. I mean, you got to remember this is common. I certainly don't think that Bruce Lee was staying celibate while he was in Hong Kong. I think that's naive and really, even should he. But point is, he was married and had children at home in the U.S. But spending months somewhere else and not having much money where people can come at least and visit didn't work well. So this is, of course, common, but again, it shows you who Bruce Lee was in terms of this was perfectly acceptable to him. So the whole idea is that all of a sudden he's there, they're meeting for a script, whatever little comical thing comes out of what the reason for all these things was. And given this particular medication, and of course all of these things are unclear exactly, but they're blaming this medication, of course, like the actual doctors there have any credibility. You got to remember, everybody's controlled, everybody's got at, there's no police. So you're harassed by somebody, you go to the police, then they take a police report, and then they call the person there to say, yeah, this guy filed a complaint on you. When do I get my check? So the whole idea is that's how the world works everywhere. So, and to think that at those times, it's probably even worse in these areas. So, as I mentioned, corrupt cops are making $18,000 to $20,000 a week. Mind-boggling. So the whole idea is that this happened, and all of a sudden he's dead. Now here's a guy who's extremely physically fit. If he did have a back problem, he was coming back from that. He worked very hard to do that. Whether he was in constant pain or other things is kind of unknown, because he didn't seem to be having prescriptions for anything from the United States, which I'm assuming if he wanted to get medications for pain or other things, he could have. But of course, he was very careful about his particular image in the United States as well. But certainly, you think he would have done that, considering he was into all sorts of different things that seemed to have been covered up, carrying guns, all the other things that he potentially did. So the whole idea is that there doesn't seem to be any medical history of Bruce Lee in the United States of having any serious problems. So all of a sudden he goes over there. He has these problems which result in his death after a relatively short period of time. So this all stinks to high heaven. Now the book, of course, who wanted to grab your attention and get the sale by saying, is he alive, pretty much refutes the fact that he is alive, living somewhere, or hiding. Now, this is a thing that seems to happen with a lot of famous people because pressures get too much. Of course, let's go to the old Elvis Presley thing. Of course, Elvis is alive and so forth. This is something that seems to go around for one reason or another. And so it's difficult to ascertain all the details of what exactly going on here. But the bottom line is that it sure points to and sure appears to be, and most things in life are planned. Things like this generally don't happen to people unless it's some sort of blatant accident that isn't connected. But accidents can't be in any way given to happenstance either. So who did what where and what was happening? Well, this whole honeypot thing where all of a sudden he goes to this actress's house given a pill, had problems before that. All of these things all of a sudden happen to a person who's supposed to be in super high physical condition. So even if he was, had a hurt back and was taking medication like millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people do around the world, and they don't die from their medications, then what was the problem here? So, and what were the medical records in the United States of Bruce Lee and so forth? You can't, so all these things don't seem to be overly well known. So there's gossip in one way or in both directions, which is very interesting. And of course, this is how all these things work. They make sure the fact that they put together a proper story. People are blackmailed and convinced. Chuck Norris came out and said that Bruce Lee died because of this taking this wrong medication. Well, the point is he's certainly not a person that has any credibility either. You have to understand how all this works. So the whole idea is, since there are no law enforcement, if you are threatened by anybody or they decide to follow your family or anything else, as they do, harass you in where you go, he can't do anything. So, they feed him a story. He thinks he knows what's going on. The gossip through the martial arts community. All this stuff is meaningless because it's planted there by controlled cowardice people. And that's a plain and simple reality. This happens on every single level. And let's get very, very clear. People somehow think that martial arts and other people are tougher or better, or they're going to fight. Nonsense. I found actually the opposite. The military, the martial arts people are the biggest cowards I've ever met. And they easily are buffaloed. A Los Angeles organization who wrote a book on Taoist sorcery completely caved in to even the slightest pressure on them by organized crime. So it goes on and on with these people of they don't really do anything. So it's like so many people that, there's so many guns in the United States, but it's amazing how rarely they're ever used. So it's a whole story that goes on. It's a fascinating thing. All those people who want to harp on Bruce Lee, well, maybe you ought to get into something that really has value. And the value is, if Bruce Lee could do anything, would be to point up the horrible corruption that is out there in general, and particularly in Hong Kong with the triads. Instead of trying to prove what a great fighter is when he never really fought, and you like him or not, and he had technical skills, looked good on film, what does that all mean? You like it? Fine. You think it's a great system? Well, it's certainly plenty of there out there. He's left enough writings to follow things. And there are people that follow those particular traditions that will teach you. That's all well and good. Then do it. But the point is that the bottom line is that here's a guy who everybody wants to idolize now. And it comes down to the fact that he was murdered. And nobody talks about it.